Okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining. Just dialed in now, so I'll just give everyone a second. I can see the participants number going up there. Okay, great. Welcome everyone to our Avian Influenza H5N1 webinar for the dairy industry. My name's Andy Hancock and I'm the Sustainable Animal Care Manager at Dairy Australia. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. And we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people online with us today. Thanks very much for joining. We've actually had about 350 people register for today, which really highlights that this is an important issue for the Australian dairy industry. We know and understand the threat of avian influenza strain H5N1 entering Australia is something that the dairy industry is very concerned about. And many people across the industry and government have been working hard to ensure we're as prepared as possible for a potential incursion. Before we start the webinar proper, I thought I might set the scene with a short anecdote. A couple of weeks ago, my wife and I were walking along the beach and came across a dead penguin, which was clearly only recently dead. I made an offhand remark that this may be the first H5N1 case in Australia. And my wife, who is a government vet and clearly a more diligent vet than I, said, "You know, you may be right. I better grab a sample for testing." Fortunately, she had some gear in the car to appropriately collect the penguin, and she sent off a sample the next day. Now, don't worry, it was negative. But this event made me think about how we can all contribute to biosecurity. Yes, there are big government and industry preparedness programs, and they're really important. And we're going to hear a bit more about those today. But what's just as important is you guys in the audience who are working with animals every day. Those little things that we can do every day in our own businesses, they don't seem like a lot, but combined, they make a crucial contribution. In short, biosecurity is a shared responsibility. Anyway, I thought that would be an appropriate scene setter for today's discussion, as the speakers will aim to provide you with that information to help you make your contributions to the larger effort. So before we get started, some housekeeping. Please note that this webinar is going to be recorded and will be circulated via email, along with being made available on the EAD preparedness website that Ash has just shared with you on the link, on the chat. There's a Q&A button available at the bottom of your screens, and I encourage you to submit questions at any time throughout the webinar. Your questions will come through to Ashley Gardner, who's the Stakeholder Engagement Issues Manager at Dairy Australia, who many of you will know, and she will facilitate a Q&A following the presentations. Whilst it's unlikely that we'll be able to answer all of the questions submitted during the webinar, we'll be documenting them all, and we'll look to address as many of these as possible through the FAQ section or other resources available on the Emergency Animal Disease page provided in the chat just now. Before we start with the presentations, I'd like to apologise on behalf of Dr. Brant Smith, who's the National Animal Disease Preparedness Coordinator at the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, apologies. Brant's unwell today and unable to attend, but in his place, we have a very capable replacement in Dr. Luke Osborne, who's the head of the HPAI task force at DAF. So thanks very much, Luke, for joining at short notice. Luke will provide an update on this task force, which is the Australian Government HPAI Preparedness Task Force, as well as the government response to H5N1 to date. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Luke. Thanks again for your time. I'll hand over now.
Thanks, Andy, and thank you all for the opportunity and the invitation to speak to you today. I'd like to echo Andy's acknowledgement of country and just acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra, and just extend my recognition to the Ngunnawal people and other peoples with connection to the lands of ACT and the surrounding region, and extend that recognition to the lands for those who others may be joining us from today, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people who may also be on the call this afternoon. So yes, Andy said, just stepping in for Brant this morning. So just really want to highlight the work that we've been doing in conjunction with a number of our national stakeholders out of the Australian Government's HPAI Preparedness Task Force. So as people will probably appreciate, we remain the only continent free from H5N1 HPAI, but we know the risk is increasing, particularly on that migratory bird pathway, and we've been really looking to enhance national preparedness activities in recent times, just building on our well-established national systems and approach to emergency animal disease preparedness more broadly across our biosecurity system, which remains central to everything that we're doing in terms of protecting Australia's agriculture, our economy, environment, and human health. So really wanted to take the time today to highlight the significant investment that the government's announced as recently as last week into the national HPAI preparedness efforts. So that builds on an announcement that was made earlier in the year in July with an initial sort of $6.9 million investment into our preparedness activity, and really symptomatic, I guess, of the approach that we've taken within government, which is really building on the One Health approach to this cross-sectoral disease threat. So the $95 million announcement last week is comprised of the breakdown that you can see on the screen across the agriculture, environment, and health portfolios. So the $37 million for agriculture really is to enhance national coordination of our response arrangements, communication and strengthening surveillance, and boosting our biosecurity capacity and capability across the production sector and for environmental biosecurity more broadly. At the money for the environment sector there, 35.9 is really to focus on preparedness planning and protective action on an evidence-based approach to some of our most at-risk species and important natural places, and our colleagues in the Department of Environment are leading those elements, and the human health component there really focusing on our national preparedness to with regard to pandemic influenza vaccines to really support the human health component, noting the potential influenza pandemic of this particular virus. So the funding really focuses on those elements and is really geared to complement the broader range of preparedness activities that we have in train, which is highlighted on the next slide. So as I touched on earlier, we're really looking to build on our established systems and national arrangements. The Australian Government HPAI Preparedness Task Force was brought into being in July, so I've got the privilege of heading up that collection of dedicated capability across the agriculture, environment, health and emergency management portfolios to really bring a focus on integrated, not just One Health, but whole of government approach to our preparedness activities at the national level. So that is across Commonwealth with the jurisdictions and obviously with the key other stakeholders, including industry, and certainly appreciate the interest, as Andy touched on, in terms of the numbers of participants today across the dairy and the cattle sector. And we were pretty actively engaged with a number of other stakeholders, particularly obviously in the poultry production sector, and with our environment non-government organisations as well that have been particularly active with regard to their involvement in the preparedness activities at the national level. So as touched on by that slide, there's a number of elements occurring. Surveillance obviously plays a pivotal role in our preparedness activities and goes to the point I made earlier around the previous and ongoing investment that we have in this country around the surveillance program. And so the National Avian Influenza Wild Bird Surveillance Program is in place for a number of years now, and serves as that sort of early warning capability. And the department also has a very active program under the Northern Australia Quarantine Strategy to support broader early detection and monitoring for avian influenza, and obviously we've been ramping up activities in that space in recent years as well in response to the ongoing global situation with regard to H5N1. A key component of our preparedness activity in recent months has been exercise volare, which is highlighted on the slide there. So I wanted to really break that down because that has been a pretty significant national collaboration across August and September this year. It was done at the request of agricultural ministers who met in July. So it has been a pretty accelerated program, which just highlights just the urgency with which the governments collectively, along with our stakeholders, are placing on this particular disease threat. So the scenario that was the basis for this exercise really was around the detection of H5N1 in wildlife, which is, remains the most likely scenario for it to appear in Australia, noting the white migratory bird pathway that I touched on earlier. Particularly appreciative that there were a number on the call today that did have the opportunity to participate in exercise volare. It was a series of 3 activities which really radiated out in terms of national preparedness, with the initial activity focused on Australian government agencies under that One Health umbrella, extended out to jurisdictional engagement under the same formula. And then the third activity in September broadened out to the range of stakeholders who I touched on earlier. So we did see some significant engagement in the course of those activities, with over 160 participants in activity 3, and we did recently deliver that broader national webinar on the 4th of October, which was very well attended, just to share the broader insights and learnings and opportunities for exercise volare for the broader stakeholders at the national level. The objectives there, as highlighted on the slide, were really affirmed through the exercise. Certainly was a highly successful example of national collaboration. While it did reinforce some of those key strengths that I highlighted earlier, particularly around our existing biosecurity system and our response capability, particularly with the architecture that we have available in the agricultural space, in terms of the response arrangements and the capability of agriculture and biosecurity agencies. It also highlighted those opportunities that we've got to further strengthen and invest in our preparedness, which certainly supported the suite of measures that were announced last week by the government, and which I've touched on already. So as part of our approach, which will be the next slide, we really are continuing to focus on our obligation, ongoing collaboration and engagement. Opportunities like today, really symptomatic of that approach that we're adopting nationally, not just in response to the biosecurity threat, but also the strong and active stakeholder engagement in how we can collectively complement each other's efforts in the biosecurity space. As Andy touched on, it is a shared responsibility, so we all do have our roles to play in the national system. And we've been particularly active over the last 6 months or so in particular, noting the emergence of this particular strain in the US, which I'm sure my colleague Dr. Brian Clark will get onto in a minute in terms of some of the technical characteristics and the insights and experiences there. But we'll continue to, as I said, actively engage with our key stakeholders in terms of the cattle sector more broadly. We did develop some material earlier in this year, which was really geared to some of those technical considerations coming out of the US and the implications for the Australian sector. And we have been actively involved with not just Dairy Australia, but Cattle Australia as well, as some of the broader stakeholders presented at the Animal Health Australia Members Forum recently in Canberra. I know Andy was there. I saw him up the back on some of our preparedness activities. We were fortunate enough to be invited to present up in Queensland at their Beef Roundtable recently as well. Events like today's proceedings, just a further opportunity to continue to engage. So as I said, particularly as we roll through now implementation of the funding announcement, there'll be further opportunities to continue to engage and invest in complementary activities across the country, with a particular emphasis obviously on states and territories, which are a key component of our national biosecurity system, along with affected industry parties such as yourselves. So I might leave it there in terms of just coverage of the general preparedness, and we can come back to Q&A later in the session. Thanks, Andy.
Great. Thanks very much, Luke. And again, appreciate you coming in at short notice. It's really encouraging to hear about these significant additional resources that the federal government's investing into HPAI preparedness. We really look forward to hearing more how that might impact the dairy industry. And we do appreciate the engagement, as you've just mentioned, with the cattle sector, when obviously there's a lot going on with poultry and birds and all of that as well. So thanks for joining. Next, we have Dr. Brian Clark, who's a Principal Regulatory Scientist in the Animal Biosecurity Branch at DAF. And Brian's going to provide an overview of the international avian influenza H5N1 situation. Over to you, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Hopefully everyone can see my slides. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of the current global situation for H5N1 HPAI, with a real focus on the current situation in dairy in the US. So for a bit of background, the current dominant HPAI strain spreading globally is H5 2.3.4.4b. This clade or group of highly related HPAI viruses has been unprecedented in its terms of its global spread and severity. This strain of HPAI is better adapted, or seems to be better adapted, to infecting and being transmitted by a very wide range of wild bird species when compared to other strains. And this has led to a high frequency of intercontinental spread of HPAI by these wild birds. It's really important to continue to remember, and we'll keep pointing it out, Australia remains the only continent free of H5 2.3.4.4.4b. Since 2021, there have been outbreaks across Asia, Europe, Middle East, Africa, North America, South America, and Antarctica. And as well as affecting wild birds, 2.3.4.4b has caused unprecedented outbreaks in wild mammals as well as wild birds. Something also unique to this strain is it's been shown to persist in these wild bird populations for extensive periods of time, and we're not seeing what we would normally consider to be seasonal changes in HPAI infection across the summer period. So we're seeing a really persistence in wild bird populations. Uniquely and importantly, in March 2024, HPAI H5 was detected in dairy cattle in the United States. For this strain, infection dairy in the US is unique, as despite the persistence of virus and infections across the globe, no other detections of H5 HPAI have been reported in cattle. So, as of last week, 305 dairy herds across 14 states have been infected with H5N1 HPAI, and there have been 10 cases in people exposed to dairy cattle in these states. There are several important factors which kind of contributed to this extensive spread of virus. Most importantly, HPAI was not expected in cattle, and the initial clinical signs were mild, and clinical signs are mild. So that led to a delay of detection of these initial cases. And because of this delay, there had been significant interstate movements prior to confirmation of H5 HPAI. So the story so far was initial clinical investigations of an unexplained illness in dairy cattle started in late January 2024, with HPAI not being confirmed until 2 months later on the 25th of March. By this time, the virus had spread in dairy across numerous states, with reports of decreased milk yields, and shortly thereafter, the virus was confirmed in 8 other states. From the genome of the virus, the genetic evidence suggests that the virus was circulating in cattle for approximately 4 months prior to the detection in March 2024. Given this is such an unprecedented situation, there's still quite a lot we don't know about the routes and modes of transmission, although there is evidence that the virus is spread by cattle which are not showing clinical signs of disease. One of the good things about this is we can learn from the United States. And should HPAI arrive in Australia, we will be much better prepared and informed to detect HPAI early and reduce any possible transmission. So the HPAI H5N1 situation in the US really is unique. It's associated with a specific subclade or subgenotype of H5N1 known as B313. And so B313 is the result of reassortment or the blending of the circulating H5 HPAI virus with US origin low pathogenic avian influenza gene segments. So this is a virus that is unique to the United States, and B313 has never been detected outside the United States. The infection of the dairy population in the US is most likely, and we believe, to have originated from a single bird to dairy cow interaction or spillover in late 2023. And then the transmission has continued to spread between cattle. At that point, this is just a theory, and we don't know enough about the spillover events, and therefore we can't really specifically identify what the risk factors for that spillover occurred. It's most likely and may have been completely random. The right virus at the right place, or the wrong virus at the right place at the right time. So, following that initial spillover event, there's evidence to suggest there have been various routes of transmission and spread, although there's still a great deal we don't know. So continued transmission between premises really has been associated due to interstate and regional movement of livestock, people, and equipment. We do suspect cattle transmission does occur, although the exact mechanism is still being studied. Most possible that this is viral transmission through contaminated fomites or equipment or mechanical means, including through the milking process. There is also evidence that this virus can spread from cattle to poultry, and evidence from viral sequencing is that affected dairy herds can spread this virus to nearby poultry premises. At this point, a great deal of work is still being undertaken to understand this cattle to bird transmission. And there has also been transmission from cattle into other mammals and avian species. So most notably, virus has been found in cats, which have been found dead or nearby some affected dairy farms, and have been detected with the same virus that's found in the same cattle. And cats that have been fed raw colostrum and milk from infected cows showed about 50% mortality. So we know that there is lots of virus in milk. So in Australia, our locally circulating LPAI viruses are unique. We have our own unique strains of these viruses. And in Australia, these viruses are naturally carried by wild birds, so including ducks, and these birds don't really show any sign of clinical disease. LPAI in Australia is known to spill over from wild birds to domestic poultry occasionally, and we've seen this recently through H7 spillover in New South Wales, the ACT, and Victoria. These H7 viruses are not the same as the HPAI viruses we see internationally, and there have been no reports of any local domestic associated avian influenza viruses affecting dairy cattle or any other mammals in Australia. So in Australia, we've had 8 outbreaks of HPAI since 1976. And in each of these cases, we believe the source of these outbreaks is the domestic LPAI viruses introduced into poultry through the local wild birds. And previously to these current H7 outbreaks, all of these outbreaks have been successfully eradicated, and we are moving towards eradication of the current H7 outbreak when we have not seen any new detections in any property since early July. So, what is the risk of HPAI H5 entering Australia? Australia is currently free from HPAI H5N1. However, we have seen this particular strain spread rapidly and in an unprecedented manner between the continents. So we really must be prepared. So the Australian government is working with our states and territories and experts on risk assessments around the currently circulating H5N1 strains. And there's a risk assessment that was finalised in 2023 and is available on the Wildlife Health Australia site. This report concluded that the risk has increased and that there are several factors which have contributed to this. Primarily the ability of the currently circulating H5N1 strain to infect a greater range of wild birds than are normally susceptible. So this report doesn't address the risk that this specific B313 North American genotype entering Australia. However, it's worth noting that this is very unlikely to be the same risk as the globally circulating H5 HPAI 2.3.4.4b. This B13 strain is currently unique to the United States and has not been detected outside the United States, even in its neighbouring countries. So, and it's really worth keeping in mind that despite the huge number of HPAI H5 infections we've seen around the globe, throughout Europe and Asia, we've never seen this virus spill over into cattle anywhere else other than the United States. So whilst we can't completely rule out the likelihood of the North American B313 strain arriving in Australia, or indeed an unrelated spillover event occurring, it really is quite unlikely. B313 has not been seen outside the United States, including in Canada, and really we have not seen any other H5 spillovers into cattle, really despite the ongoing circulation of these viruses. So what I might do is just leave it there, and then more than happy to discuss any questions as we go into the panel discussion at the end.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. That was a really useful technical overview of the spillover event that's happened in the US and gives us a better understanding of what that means for us from a risk perspective. I guess now to segue back to what does it mean for Australia, our final speaker is going to talk about, I guess, a dairy-specific overview of what's happening in the US and how that might occur in Australia and some important biosecurity measures that farmers can take to prevent the risk of spread and the impact on their farm. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Zoe Vogels, who's the National Milk Quality and Biosecurity Lead for Dairy Australia. Over to you, Zoe.
Thanks, Andy. And look at me trying to get my screen to share properly, which I'm not doing very well. Sorry. Hang on. Bear with me, everybody. That looks better. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the clinical signs of bird flu in cattle and also cats and people for that matter. This is the similar to the map that Brian showed earlier. I did my screenshot late last night, and so you can see that in a week's there's actually been an increase in cases. I think this is a really useful website just to have pinned to your search bar. And the other thing that is really interesting about this site that shows the map of affected farms in the US is you can also have a look at it by the total outbreak, or also by the last 30 days. And you can see that when you look at the last 30 days that the new cases are all in pretty much California and Idaho, and the new cases in the rest of the country have stopped. So I think that's a good sign, I think, but also it's a good way just of monitoring how the outbreak in the US is going, if you're interested. In terms of what are the clinical signs of bird flu in dairy cattle, I've just got a slide that kind of shows what's been reported in terms of most common to least common. So most of the farms are reporting a significant drop in milk production in their milking cows, anywhere from 20% to 100% of the milk production. They're seeing significant drops in water intake and dry matter intake. They're seeing abnormal milk, which I'll talk about in the next slide, and cows are having a fever. And the farms that have got rumination collars or ear tag things that monitor temperature are picking up significant fevers. The next kind of group of symptoms, which is seen by at least half of the farms, is they're seeing dehydration in the cattle, decrease in rumen motility, and again, this is where the rumination collars have been useful in picking up, affected animals. They're reporting abnormal feces, which is anywhere from really dry, tacky feces to diarrhea. They're reporting nasal discharge, which might be clear, it might be a bit pussy, or it might be blood stained, and an increase in respiratory rates. And then the least common group of symptoms that people are reporting in their cattle is pneumonia and laboured breathing. So that's like really significant lung disease. Some of them are reporting abortion in cattle. They're reporting lameness, and they're also reporting neuroscience. And so the neuroscience was a little bit unclear. They just said neurological. But this that little box that just has come up, I recommend maybe just taking a photo if you're interested. It's actually a case where they're describing experimental infection of calves and cattle with H5N1. And so it talks about how they do it, and it talks about the signs that they see. And some of the signs in the cattle were like staggering and weakness and instability. So I imagine that might be the neurological signs that they're reporting. A bit more on this study, if you want to have a read of it, is they did nasal exposure of calves. So they kind of inoculated their nose with the virus, and those calves, they ended up showing like a bit of nasal discharge and mild respiratory signs, like a bit of a cough, but were fairly unaffected. And in the cows, they actually introduced the virus into the quarters of all four quarters, introduced it directly, and those cows were quite sick. So they had the drop in milk production, they had the fever, they had the drop in water and dry matter intake, and they were really significantly affected, in part possibly because they were given quite a large dose. In terms of the clinical signs in milk, this is just a photo from another case study where they reported what they found on farm. There's a change in consistency, so it might be lots of clots, there might be flakes, it might be thickened, or it might be clear. And the thickened, they're kind of talking about like colostrum, so really, really thick rather than milk consistency. And also discoloured. So obviously from those photos there, yellow, red, brown, grey, but really pretty gross. And as Brian mentioned earlier, high levels of the virus are detected in the milk, but also in the udder tissue of cows that they've post-mortemed, of those clinically affected cows. And I think Andy asked me this earlier, is it all four quarters or single quarters? And I think I remember reading that it's not always all four quarters. Sometimes it could be 1 quarter or 2 quarters that are affected with this change in milk. In terms of what the impact's been at the herd level, the proportion of the herd that's been affected, and this is going by what's been reported, in the news and in some of the government reports. For most of the states, it's been anywhere from 5 to 25% of the herd affected. I think read one there was up to 40%. But recently, I think in the last month, with California farms being affected, that proportion's a lot higher, anywhere from 50 to 60% of the herd affected. So if you're like a 3,000 cow farm, that's 1,500 cows that are affected. They suspect that why it's been so bad in California compared to the other states is that there has been a significant heat wave. So this is just the temperature they grabbed last night for October in California, in the Central Valley. And you can see that, it was at 40 degrees Celsius, so and quite higher than average. In terms of the mortality rates, generally quite low in most of the states that they've reported. In California, again, it's been a lot higher, so 10 to 15% of cows dying. And if it's really, really hot and you're sick with bird flu and you don't actually want to drink because that's how you're feeling, they're more likely to get dehydrated, and then obviously they're more likely to die. So I think this is important to take note of, that weather conditions might be impacting, morbidity and mortality rates. In terms of other impacts for the herd, the bulk milk cell count it rises up to double and can take a month or two to get back to the baseline. And also, for cows that do recover, they get sick and then they slowly recover, they'll never reach that milk production that they were making before that they were sick. So for example, she might have been making 45 litres, she gets sick, and when she does recover, she's not making any more than 30 to 35 litres. So it can be a significant drop in milk production. One of the figures I think it's a bit hazy is how many cows are actually culled. So they might have survived, but they might not still be on the farm. And that's a figure that I can't find, but perhaps contributed to the spread of the disease between farms. And this is just something to take a photo of and have a read of it in your own time. It's just a farmer talking about how it impacted his farm and how he detected it and how he treated his cows and just what it was like. So I think it's a useful thing to kind of read and get an idea of what farmers are going through. Brian mentioned this again, bird flu in dairy cats. At least a quarter of the farms that have had bird flu have reported having dead cats that had access to colostrum and waste milk. They see depression, incoordination, blindness, circling, and nasal and ocular discharge before they die. And on post-mortem, it's encephalitis, so brain infection, pneumonia, and myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart. So really not a nice way to go at all for these poor cats. And this clinical disease and the lesions that they're seeing is consistent with the previous disease detected in cats with H5N1 infections. So there's been cats detected with bird flu in America in the last couple of years, but they've been from consuming wild infected birds or wild poultry. So it certainly ties in that it's an oral infection from drinking the milk. In terms of infections in dairy farm staff, the CDC they're monitoring that, and they also have a map. There's not as many states affected as for cattle. And so in terms of these are official cases that have been, confirmed by health authorities. There's a couple in Michigan, one in Texas and Colorado, and a lot in California. And I imagine that's because there's a lot more cows affected. So there's going to be greater exposure to infected animals. And I guess just a note, there's also some poultry workers in there as well. So I think it's probably important to clarify when people talk about numbers of people officially infected, some are poultry workers, some are dairy workers. The signs that have been seen are conjunctivitis, and hemorrhage in the conjunctiva. I've seen a photo, which I didn't put up because anyway, but really, really bloody whites of your eyes, and only mild respiratory symptoms. And I mean, one of the reasons that H5N1 is, people are concerned about it globally is because when it does infect people, it does make them really sick. It doesn't seem to be as such the case with dairy workers. And, I guess we imagine that they're getting infected through contact with aerosols or splashes of, infected milk or urine while they're milking. So it's kind of topical topical exposure as opposed to walking into a poultry shed and breathing it in. So that's how it's presenting in dairy staff. And I guess the last slide I was going to talk about, it's like the whole point is, biosecurity and how do you prevent, bird flu from coming onto your farm. So there's a lot of things that have to happen, for that to happen. Like it's got to come, the virus has to actually enter Australia, get into the wild bird population and then somehow expose itself to cattle. I just found this is a useful way, I think, of thinking about what it is that you can do. And it's called like the zones of control or something. So the first zone is the things that you just can't control or influence. Then there's things that you can influence. And then there's things that you have control over. So for example, we've got no control over whether bird flu enters Australia. There's lots of migratory birds. They all got these different pathways and you've got no control over that. So you don't have to worry about that because what will be, I guess. The next thing is things you can influence. So we do have some way of influencing whether it gets onto farm. And this is just kind of back to Andy's talk about, the penguin that they found on the beach. Like we want to reduce the kind of the infective pressure coming from, birds and wildlife. So we want to detect it early. We want to somehow, do whatever we can to assist, people working with wildlife to reduce the impact. So, for example, the first thing you can do is you can get the emergency animal disease watch hotline on your phone. Like I've got it on my phone. So if I come across a penguin and, I know what number to call. So that's something that we can all do. We're influencing it, but not having total control. The other thing, is just you can influence how it gets on your farm. For example, having a closed herd, not buying stock. So it was in America, Brian said, it's been spread through animal movements. That's something that you can do. You can't control the birds that come onto your farm necessarily, but you can control what cows come onto your farm. You could not have, make sure that you don't have shared tracks between vehicles and stock. There's still a bit unsure as to how much of a role vehicles are playing, but you could, if there's no contact between them and cattle, then that's something you can try and minimise. And then there's things that you really do have a control over, and that's how it's spread on farm if it does happen to arrive, which I think is actually quite important to reduce its impact. So, for example, milking, there's infective virus in the milk, and we know through that experiment that if you have it on intramammary tubes or it can get into the teat, then it can cause infections. So you milk your mastitis cows in a separate herd so that there's no shared teat cups. You don't feed calves raw milk if it happens to arrive. So just to reduce any risk of them getting infected through drinking milk. And you make sure you've got protective clothing for staff. So the CDC's got guidelines as to, best things to wear. I mean, obviously gloves and aprons and things like that, but, masks, goggles, face things, a little bit of a kind of a throwback to COVID, but, if you can prevent getting bird flu, that would be great. So that's just, I guess, something for you guys to think about, draw your circles and start filling it in as we go. And I'm done there, Andy. So on to Q&A, I think.
Yeah, thanks very much, Zoe. That was a fantastic presentation. We'll get stuck straight into the Q&A. So we've got about 15 minutes, a bit over. So we've got an opportunity to address some of the questions that have come through during the webinar. Please feel free to put some more in the Q&A if you have some. On our panel today, we've got the two guest speakers that you've just heard from, so Dr. Brian Clark and Dr. Zoe Vogels. And we'd also like to welcome Justin Toohey, who's joining. Justin's the expert advisor for Australian dairy farmers on animal health, welfare and biosecurity matters. And we really appreciate your time and coming in to join the panel today, Justin. So thank you. Just quickly, before we get into the questions, we understand that many of you will be wanting to know about what type of control measures might be put in place in the event of an incursion, for example, movement restrictions or culling of animals. It's important to note that for any EAD outbreak, control measures are decided and implemented by individual states and territories, and they depend on the characteristics of the outbreak, and they're based on a risk assessment of the various options at the time. So for that reason, we may not be able to provide definitive answers for some of those questions. However, I'm sure that our panelists will address some of the guiding principles of control and also discuss learnings taken from the control measures applied in the US. So to help with this session, I'll hand over to Ash Gardner, who's been monitoring the questions. and we'll facilitate the Q&A. So over to you, Ash.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andy. The first question, I'll send it to you, Brian and Dav. And I'll just try and work through the questions in the most common themes coming through. So what would be the impact on trade or export of live cattle and dairy products if in the unlikely event of a H5N1 incursion in Australia?
Thanks, Ashley. Luke, do you want to grab that one out of the task force, or otherwise I'm happy to? I think we've still got you here, Luke. Or not?
Yep, I'm still here. I just don't have video functionality, but I'm happy to take that one if people. Here we go. We might be back on. So yeah, I think it's certainly a fair question, and yeah, anticipate the interest on that one. As we've touched on, we're fortunate to remain free from this particular strain of H5N1, and unfortunately, going to Andy's point, it's difficult to be definitive with some of this material. We can't accurately anticipate how trading partners may respond in the event of H5N1 incursion in Australia. We have recently had that experience, obviously, with the H7 outbreak, which was touched on, which is a different strain, but we know that it is a trade-sensitive disease, and importing countries, in the same way that Australia is entitled to, based on their own science and risk-based assessments, can introduce measures if they are so inclined. However, as Brian indicated, we have been actively monitoring the situation with the US and overseas, particularly with regard to trade implications, and we haven't seen anything significant really occur in response. So again, we'd be taking our cues from, I guess, the global experience in terms of superimposing, what we might expect to see here in the event that we do have an incursion. But ultimately, I think we can, while there's no guarantees, take a reasonable level of comfort that we haven't seen any significant implications.
Okay, thanks, Luke. Justin, I might send this one to you. So would there be a livestock standstill or movement restrictions implemented in the unlikely event of an outbreak? I feel like I need to add that disclaimer at the end of the question.
Yeah, thanks, Ash. Yeah, as we've been from all the presentations, we're feeling our way a little bit here, but we do know that the chief veterinary officers of the affected state or territory will be making the decisions on this. It's very unlikely we'll have a national livestock standstill. That tends to be restricted only to foot and mouth disease incursions, so we're planning for that. But in this case, it'll probably be movement restrictions applied to the specific farms that are showing infection. So there'll be quarantine put on those farms. I think incubation for this disease period, the incubation period is sort of 2 to 9, or 2 to 7, 2 to 9 days, that sort of thing. And there tends to be 2 incubation periods to cover with a quarantine period. So farms would be quarantined for potentially 20, 21 days, certainly the case in the US. And that quarantine would mean livestock restrictions, movement restrictions from that farm. But there may be a choice made by the chief veterinary officers to extend beyond the farm just into a more localized region or a restricted area a bit further out. But again, that's a decision we can't predict at this stage. Thanks.
Thanks, Justin. And I think another one for you, would my herd be culled if we had H5N1?
I don't believe it's happening in the US. There's no sort of standard order to cull herds. It'll be a dairy farmer decision as to when they return to production. As Zoe pointed out, there'll be reduced production from individual animals, and how well they recover will be a matter for the farmers to decide. But I doubt there'll be any order from the chief veterinary officer culling.
Thank you. And Zoe, maybe to you for this one. We've had this come through a couple of times. Will pasteurisation kill any H5N1 in the button fat, for example?
Yes, I realise I probably should have mentioned that in the talk, because that's a really important thing. So like when it first arrived, they were looking for it in products on the shelves. They could find the DNA of the virus, but no infective virus. So they've done several studies on pasteurization of milk. They've set it up to replicate really well commercial pasteurization, which is 72 degrees for 15 seconds. And it was effective at killing the virus. And they had a range of viruses, from above what you would even expect to have subclinical cows in the vat. And it was effective. So yes, for that specific commercial pasteurization, they haven't looked at, there's other ways of heat treating milk, during processing, which they haven't investigated. But for the most, for the key commercial pasteurization, yes, it is effective.
Thank you. And another one for you, Zoe. So in your presentation, the clinical signs you talked about there, was that natural or experimentally infected?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that was naturally. So the three big ones were what the farms are reporting in America, and they really did match what was also seen clinically in that study. Though that study, I think that was quite a big dose that they were exposed to. So their cows were really sick. But obviously, if you have 100% milk loss, you're pretty sick. If you have 20% milk loss, you're not as sick. So yeah.
Yep. Thank you. And one more, Zoe, and then we'll move to someone else. Right. Is there a test for H5N1 for dairy cattle in Australia?
So I guess there's not currently one in Australia specific for dairy cattle, but there is a lot of diagnostic tests in America. So, that'd be something we'd be able to implement pretty quickly. I would say that in America, they do have, you have to do diagnostic tests before you can move cattle across state lines. Colorado has actually implemented compulsory weekly bulk fat monitoring, which would probably explain why they have a high number of detected cases, because they're picking up all cases. And there is they've implemented started a voluntary testing program, which as of last night had 64 farms who'd signed up for it. So not a high voluntary sign up, but yes, there's certainly tests that you can do of bulk milk.
Great, thank you. Brian, I might send this one your way. If the virus is in milk and can infect birds and other animals, what's the best way to dispose of the milk?
Thanks, Ash. So I guess in terms of disposing of milk, it's really important to understand that there is a lot of virus in milk, and that we take precautions so that discarded milk does not become the point of new spread. Really, it's going to be important for people to talk to their state and territory animal health authorities to get as much advice as they possibly can, both around the safe disposal of milk, but also ensuring that any environmental protection laws are followed as well. And it's really going to depend on lots of the very local factors. So in the case of that, in terms of disposal of milk, I very much encourage you to be talking as much as you possibly can and as quickly as you can to the state and territories involved.
Thank you. Maybe back to you, Zoe. Can we feed infected milk to calves?
Sorry, I'm just trying to unmute myself. I would say no. They haven't, I've tried to find any reports of disease in calves in America. They have more set up for pasteurizing waste milk and before they feed them. And so they have actually been feeding pasteurized waste milk in the outbreak, and I can't find any reports of calves, but I would not, in light of those calves, the dairy cats getting sick from drinking milk. I would just assume that, yes, let's just assume that calves could get sick from drinking milk as well, and I would not do it. So buy milk replacer instead, rather than, or buy a pasteurizer, but that's a little less harder to set up quickly. But no, I wouldn't feed it.
Absolutely. Justin, I might send this one your way. So noting the information Luke shared around the stakeholder engagement and the beef roundtable, is there a concern about potential infection with beef cattle at all?
I'd probably like to lean on Cattle Australia to answer that, but I suspect the reason that dairy is implicated so heavily is the constant contact with and between the cattle, between the livestock and with humans and with fomites. So you can imagine pasture-fed dairy beef cattle would be probably quite safe, other than exposure from wild birds flying over that happen to be infected and happen to drop the virus in the spot where the exact animal's sitting, versus dairy operations that are quite intense relative to that. So I think it'd be quite a low risk for the beef sector.
Yep.
Even lower than for dairy.
Yeah, thank you. So we move back to you. Is there a vaccine for H5N1, and if not, are they developing one?
There's not a vaccine, but they have put asked for interests for someone in America to start developing a vaccine. So I think that's just a watch this space. And I realised that I was trying to share the links in my document to everyone in the webinar, but I realised I've just shared it to just the hosts.
That's fine. You've sent them all to me. I'll make sure.
Yeah. So apologies.
Get all the links. Yeah.
I will get the links to Ash to give to you. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely fine. So we've got you. What other animals on my farm can be infected?
I think that's a good question. So, if you've got chooks, I've got a photo of a chook we used to have at our dairy drinking milk from a colostrum bucket. So, I'd assume that your dogs could get infected because foxes can get infected in America. So, any feral foxes, dogs, alpacas can, chooks, birds. Just assume that mammals can get infected, I would say. But I guess maybe also start thinking about, well, what actually does have access to milk on my farm? And maybe I should control that access.
Thanks, Zoe. Brian, maybe this one for you. Daff, so I have a lot of birds on my farm. How can I control them?
Sorry, just fighting with the mute button. So the best way to deal with wild birds is to make the farm as unattractive as possible to those birds. Trying to manage feed availability. Making sure that it's as less attractive for the birds to be around. It's probably worth noting that culling of wild birds is not permitted and really is not effective at managing HPAI and H5, and that's been really well shown around the world in lots of different environments in terms of the spread of wild birds, and we really do know quite a lot about H5 in wild birds. And just maybe to jump back to a previous question around testing for H5, both the states and territories and ACDP down in Geelong are able to test for H5, HPAI in all species, including cattle. So we can do that testing here in Australia.
Thanks, Brian. Sorry, I guess I was just imagining like a test kit for milk, but no, yes, obviously you can test for it. Sorry.
Yeah. No worries. The vaccine development, is it for birds or cattle, Zoe?
I think they were asking for people to be interested in developing one for cattle. That's how it sounded.
Yeah.
What I was reading.
Great. Thank you. Justin, go for it. I have a question for you around what is the notification protocol if an animal shows symptoms, but you can answer that.
Weave that in at the same time.
Yeah,
that's
great.
Cool. I did mention earlier on that we're talking about the beef cattle sector, and really there's a large quadrant of this beef cattle sector involved with feedlots, more intensive production system. And while I think the comments that I made still hold, it's very important that all farmers monitor the health of their animals. Any sort of spike in respiratory problems or anything else, that symptoms they may question, they should report. And the reporting, to your question, second question there now would be to your vet, to your local vet, your government vet, whatever. The hotline as well, you've put that up a few times, 1-800-675-888. Just report it. Any question, just report it, because the earlier we diagnose, the earlier we report, the earlier we can diagnose it, and the cheaper it'll be to control and manage.
Great. Thank you, Justin. I'm just conscious of time, Andy. We have just clicked over 1 p.m. We do have a few more questions coming in, but perhaps we can keep those for either a Q&A or some various resources on the EAD website, which I've shared in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Ash. I'm sure we could sit here and talk H5N1 all day. It's been a really great session with lots of detail there. So as you'd mentioned, we're never going to get through every question, but we are going to make sure that we've documented them all, and we'll ensure that we have some answers to those questions either on the EAD preparedness page on the Dairy Australia website, or potentially links to other resources that are relevant. Of course, feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any follow-up questions as well. There was a question on the chat about sharing the link for the recording for those people that haven't registered. Can we forward that, Ash? Is that possible? If you get an email with a recording link, I think you can just forward that on, and then that person should still be able to access the recording.
Absolutely. We'll share the recording and we'll put it on the Dairy Australia YouTube as well.
Perfect. Yeah, excellent. So yeah, just to wrap up, thanks so much to Daph for attending, and for all of the panelists, Justin from ADF, Zoe from Dairy Australia, and making the time to attend, and also to you guys in the audience for making the time to attend. And I want to make a specific shout out to Ash, who's done a heap of hard work behind the scenes in coordinating the webinar, all of the logistics around getting it all set up. So a big thanks to Ash Gardner. Well done, and a great attendance. But yeah, we'll continue to keep you informed as new information emerges on this issue. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.